So we get to number 1 on our list. As I had said earlier, you could make a case that any of the top 5 on my list could have been number 1. Oliver Cromwell, the Wesleys, Thomas Cranmer, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth. Any of them actually could have been number 1. I picked Queen Elizabeth because, to a large extent, the English church as it exists today is a result. She was born in Greenwich, England, so that means that they knew exactly what time she was born. If you don't understand a reference, I'm not going to explain it. May 19, 1536, the execution of Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, and this is key, Elizabeth is declared a bastard by her loving father. And this later becomes an issue when they're talking about the succession after Edward VI. But by that time, nobody cared what Henry VIII wanted anymore, since he'd been dead for 8 or 9 years. So first Mary, who was also later declared a bastard, and then Elizabeth were made queen. 1547, death of Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. July 6, 1553, death of her half-brother, Edward VI. This is the boy king. We talked about him more last week, and we discussed the line of succession. Now, everyone agreed that Edward VI was the legitimate successor to Henry VIII. The problem is that the young king got tuberculosis, and he died before he reached age 16. So this sets up a crisis in the England succession, because the 2 daughters of Henry VIII, he had cleverly declared bastards before he died, so you can't make a bastard the queen. And then Henry VIII's 7 nieces were all women, and some of them were Catholic. One of those nieces is Mary, Queen of Scots. Well, she's as Catholic as the Pope is. So there was this kind of issue that was created when Edward VI died. October 1st, 1553, half-sister Mary, or Bloody Mary, becomes queen after defeating a bid from one of those 7 cousins, or one of those 7 nieces. Lady Jane Grey, who was all of 15 years old, had no interest in being the Queen of England whatsoever. She's put into the crown and then later executed by Bloody Mary. And sometimes people say, well, did Princess Elizabeth support her half-sister becoming queen, even though her half-sister was Catholic? And the answer is yes, because Elizabeth figured, well, if she gets the succession, and she becomes queen, and she drops over, well, then we've already settled the question of whether the daughters of Henry VIII can become queen, and then I would become queen. And guess what? She was right. 1554, the outbreak of Wyatt's Rebellion, which protested the planned marriage of Mary to Prince Philip of Spain. Prince Philip is the son of Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Elizabeth was not part of this rebellion. However, her sister Mary thought that she might be, and she actually threw Elizabeth into prison for a while. And one of the great ironies of history, Mary did go on to marry Prince Philip of Spain, and 4 years later, of course, Mary keels over and dies. And Prince Philip tries to woo Princess Elizabeth to marry her. Elizabeth says, like, I'm going to marry a Catholic, right? Goodbye. And guess who was the head of the Spanish Armada that attacked England? Prince Philip. Wow. Small world.
Did he survive the trip around the UK?
Well, Philip didn't go with them. Philip sent them.
Oh, okay.
Of course.
No, we'll talk about it.
He's going to talk about this later. March 18, 1554, Elizabeth is imprisoned in the Tower for her alleged role in Wyatt's Rebellion, but no evidence was ever put forward, and eventually she was released. Which happens on May 22nd, 1554. Elizabeth is moved to Woodstock and put into a castle there under house arrest, but ominously, from the point of view of her sister Mary, There are crowds lining the road as she's being taken from the Tower to Woodstock, and the crowds are cheering Princess Elizabeth as she's been taken into house arrest. Like about a year later, Elizabeth returns to court, so now she's back in London. November 6, 1558, Mary names Elizabeth her heir, so this negates Henry VIII, making her a bastard. And Bloody Mary dies 11 days later, November 17, 1558, so she only rules for 4 years. John Fox, in his great book, Acts and Monuments, views that this was divinely inspired, that God struck down the evil Mary so that Princess Elizabeth could become queen and reign for 45 years as part of the Golden Age. January 15th, 1559, coronation of Queen Elizabeth at Westminster Abbey. All of London cheered. Elizabeth was very popular even before Mary became queen, and then after 4 years of the role of Bloody Mary, Elizabeth was even more popular. May 8, 1559, Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, and Elizabeth becomes Supreme Governor of the Church of England. That had been done away with during the reign of Queen Mary, because she had returned the church to Catholicism. Now, I know to some of you, the main issue with Elizabeth is, was she in reality as good looking as Helen Mirren or Kate Blanchett? And I know to some of you that's the main issue. Was she really a mega babe as she is portrayed as being? And I actually have a quote on that in a moment, but she contracted smallpox in May 8, 1559, and even her greatest admirers said that when she recovered from the smallpox, she was no longer the same level of babedom as she had been before the smallpox. You heard it in this class. 1559, Parliament passes the Act of Uniformity, which brings back the Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer, which of course had been thrown out when Mary took over. In 1568, Elizabeth has Mary, Queen of Scots, jailed. Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, is Elizabeth's cousin, but she is definitely the wrong religion. And at that point, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been thrown out of Scotland by John Knox and the lords of the congregation in Scotland. Strangely enough, she had run to England expecting her loving cousin was going to greet her with open arms, and almost immediately Elizabeth throws her into the Tower. 1569, a Catholic uprising in England intent on putting Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne occurs. Elizabeth orders 750 rebels to be executed. Now, Queen Mary is called Bloody Mary because she ordered the execution of between 300 or 400 church leaders. Now, of course, she did execute 3 very prominent bishops, including Thomas Cranmer, who wrote the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles. But Elizabeth could execute people when she felt it was a danger to her throne, and she had 750 rebels executed here, and of course, later executed Mary, Queen of Scots. 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth for heresy. Elizabeth's response was, yeah, whatever. Yeah, why don't you send Spain after me, then we'll settle. 1571 and 1586, there were further plots to put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. And it's the same situation that Queen Mary had with Lady Jane Grey. As long as she was alive, she was a symbol for the opposition. So you knew at some point Elizabeth was going to have to do something about Mary, Queen of Scots. April 4th, 1581, she knights Sir Francis Drake for circumnavigating the globe. If you're English, you consider Francis Drake to be one of the great commanders of all time. If you're Spanish, you consider him to be a pirate who should have been charged with war crimes. August 1585, I put this in mostly because it's such a cool name, the Treaty of Nonsuch. Between the English and the Dutch against the Spanish, and war with Spain begins. So England did have some other countries on her side. The Dutch obviously were fiercely pro-Protestant by that point, so it made perfect sense to have that. 1587, if we had a soundtrack, this is where we would go dun 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 dun. Elizabeth orders the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary is executed at Father Ingay Castle in Northamptonshire. I just this past week, somebody posted on Facebook that Mary, Queen of Scots was executed in the Tower. That is absolutely not true. She was executed in Father Ingay Castle. July 12, 1588, the Spanish Armada heads for the English Channel. July 29, 1588, English fire ships destroy the Armada off of grave lines near Dunkirk. So if you always had the impression that somehow the Spanish Armada was sailing up the Thames when it was defeated, it actually happened off the French coast. August 8, 1588, Elizabeth addresses 23,000 of her very loyal troops at Tilbury. And the key here, they didn't have smartphones then, they didn't have CNN or Fox News. At the point that Mary gave her famous speech, the Spanish Armada had already been defeated, but the news hadn't gotten to England. So when she was giving that speech, she was telling the troops, we're about to get invaded. And this is what we need to do if we're invaded. So that's key. This was not a Spike the football speech. Hey, we defeated the Armada. This was the most powerful nation in the world is about to land troops on our soil. And you guys are the front line.
And you guys are going to die defending England.
A good chance you guys are going to die. 1589, she supports Protestant King Henry VIII in France.
Henry IV.
I thank you. 1594 to 1603, the 9 Years' War in Ireland. The revolt was finally suppressed after Elizabeth died. We should mention the late 1500s. Sometimes Elizabeth's reign is called the Golden Age. That has never been repeated. It was the time of Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Fairy Queen. It was the time of William Shakespeare. It was the time of Christopher Marlowe, who may or may not have written some of Shakespeare's works. But it was a time of great literary and artistic expression in England. March 24, 1603, Elizabeth dies in Richmond, England. James VI of Scotland is woken up one day and informed that he is now King of England, which would be, I think, a bit of a shock to anyone. James VI of Scotland, of course, is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. That was the deal that Elizabeth made with Mary. That her son would eventually become the King of England, and that happened. Elizabeth is buried in Westminster Abbey next to her sister Mary. 1604, the Treaty of London with Spain occurs. And then the more important stuff, 1971, Elizabeth is portrayed by Glenda Jackson in a wonderful movie called Mary, Queen of Scots. I highly recommend it. 1972, she's portrayed by Glenda Jackson in a miniseries called Elizabeth R, or Elizabeth Rex, Queen Elizabeth. 1998, she's portrayed by Kate Blanchett in Elizabeth. 2005, she's portrayed by Helen Mirren in the HBO miniseries Elizabeth I. And 2007, she's portrayed by Kate Blanchett in Elizabeth the Golden Age. Helen Mirren would win the Emmy for Best Actress for her portrayal of Elizabeth in the miniseries. She would also go on to win the Academy Award for Best Actress for portraying Elizabeth II in The Queen. Kate Blanchett won the Academy Award for her portrayal of Elizabeth I and Elizabeth the Golden Age.
It's good to play the Queen.
It's a good thing. There she is. And since we have a high definition projector, you can actually see it pretty well. This is known as the Armada portrait. You'll notice she has her hand on the globe, on Europe. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
You see the Armada outside the window here. You see her in all of her finery. So why is she number one? She saved the English church from a resurgent Catholicism under her half-sister, Queen Mary. Church of England, as we know today, is largely the result of Elizabeth I. Now, obviously, there was the Cromwell era, which happened 60 years later, but after Cromwell died, the church really returned to its Elizabethan form.
And she made the church of the people, not just the church for the
Of the Lord's.
Yes. That's why my brother named her number one. Because she made the Episcopal Church the people's church.
Elizabeth didn't go as far as some of her Protestant advisors. She personally was not a follower of Luther and Calvin and Zwingli. She liked crucifixes. She liked priestly vestments. She liked celibate priests. Although she didn't insist on either the crucifixes or the celibate priests, but certainly the priestly vestments survived in English church. What do you call them? Bells?
Smells and bells.
Smells and bells. You know, the incense and the funny hats and all that stuff. That
The
all
collars, the priests wear collars.
Yeah.
And
all that had been done away with by Cranmer and Edward VI, and she instituted that in the Protestant English church. But there's no question that after a 4-year reign by Queen Mary, where Catholicism had been returned in all of its glory, there's no question that it was Elizabeth who turned the church 180 degrees back in the Protestant direction. And some people would say that that wasn't the most important influence she had on the Protestant church in England. Some people would say that the defeat of the Spanish Armada at the time was viewed as the greatest Protestant power with the backside of the greatest Catholic power, and that was a sign that Protestantism was ascending.
it was the birth of the English Empire. I mean, really, the English Empire blossomed at that point, taking the Church of England across. I mean, the sun didn't set on the Church of England either.
So now we get to the issue that most of you are most interested in, which is, was she a mega babe worthy of being portrayed by Helen Mirren and Cate Blanchett?
They prefer to be called uber hotties.
Uber hotties. This comes from a wonderful book that was published in 1821 called The Memoirs of the Court of Queen Elizabeth, and there were multiple volumes. I mean, if you look this up on Google Books, you know, every scrap of paper that anybody ever wrote something down on during her reign was captured. She was a lady of great beauty and of decent stature and of excellent shape. In her youth, she was adorned with a more than usual maiden modesty. Her skin was a pure white, her hair of a yellow color, her eyes were beautiful and lively. In short, her whole body was well made, and her face was adorned with a wonderful and sweet beauty and majesty. Obviously, this was written by a fan of hers, and not her sister. This beauty lasted till her middle age, though it declined. She was a personage tall, of hair and complexion fair, and therefore well favored, but high-nosed. Of limbs and feature neat, which added to the luster of those exterior graces, of stately and majestic comportment. Participating in this more of her father than her mother, who was of an exterior allay, plausible, or as the French have it, more debonair and affable, virtues which might suit well with majesty, and which, descending as hereditary to the daughter, did render her of a more sweeter temper, and endeared her more to the love and liking of her people, who gave her the name and fame of a most gracious and popular prince. Her greatest moment as queen, her most famous moment, is when they were preparing for the Spanish to attack England and land ground forces on English soil. As we just talked about, the Armada had actually been defeated a week before over by Dunkirk, but they had not yet received the information. So on August 8, 1588, she goes to Tilbury and addresses 23,000 of her troops under the Earl of Leicester. Now, if you have watched either of the Kate Blanchett movies or you watched the Helen Mirren miniseries, you know that the Earl of Leicester was her companion, that they were close. I'll leave it at that.
Friends.
Close friends.
Definitive.
Very, very close friends. So he was in charge of her ground troops, and when she addressed the troops at Tilbury, it was his troops. She was addressing them, though, of course, she's the queen, so they're her troops too. There are 23,000 of them, and she gives one of the greatest or most famous speeches in history. It is every bit as great, it is every bit as famous as Gettysburg Address, Churchill, we will fight them on the beaches, we will never surrender. I mean, it's one of the great speeches of history. And to set up our discussion of this, we have a description of what it was like that day before she gave her speech. It had been a part of the commendation of Elizabeth that in her public appearances of whatever nature, no sovereign on record had ever acted the part so well or with such universal applause. But on this memorable and momentous occasion when, like a second Boadicea, armed for defense against the invader of her country, she fought against the Romans way back. She appeared at once the warrior and the queen. The sacred feelings of the moment appeared in all the artifices of factitious dignity and studied condescension, inspired her with that impressive earnestness of look, of words, of gesture, which alone is truly dignified and truly eloquent. Mounted on a noble charger, with a general's truncheon in her hand, a corselet of polysteel laced over her magnificent apparel, and a page in attendance bearing her white plumed helmet. So just picture this. And it doesn't say so here, but she had this long white dress on, and she has this silver breastplate. Her page is standing there wearing her plumed armor hat, and she has, the sword in her hand. She rode bareheaded from rank to rank with a courageous deportment and smiling countenance, and amid the affectionate plaudits and shouts of military ardor which burst forth from the animated, admiring soldiery, she addressed them in the following brief and spirited harangue. I turn it over to a daughter of England who was chosen for this moment because she is a daughter of England. I give you Lydia Sheffield.
My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to our armed multitude for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always believed myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you all at this time, not as for my recreation or sport, but being resolved in the midst and the heat of the battle to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and for my people, my honor and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have but the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king, and a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare invade the borders of my realms, to which rather than any dishonor should grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already by your forwardness that you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, on the word of a prince, they shall be duly paid you. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, that whom never prince commanded a more noble and worthy subject. Not doubting by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp, and your valor in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, of my kingdom, and of my people.
Bravo! Bravo! Now you notice there's some interesting points in that speech. She starts out by saying, and I'm paraphrasing of course, but she starts out by saying, you know, my advisors told me that I was pretty stupid to come out and stand on the field surrounded by 23,000 armed men. Which of course the same would be said today. When any president, you know, wants to visit the troops or something, there's always some advisor saying, well, you know, somebody could shoot there or something. But every president also says, if I can't be safe among my own military, I can't be safe among anyone.
Worked well for Anwar Sadat.
Which of course isn't the United States or England.
No, but that's another story.
And then she talks about the fact that she will be there with her troops. The Spanish land, she's not going to be hidden away someplace. She'll be with her troops. And she says, you know, I'm not as strong as you guys are. That's your job. But what does she have? She has the blood of a king, and an English king. What blood is that? It's not a trick question.
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII, thank you, Steve. She is the blood of a king. She is the blood of Henry VIII. Well, poo-poo on the Spanish if they think they're going to beat somebody who's descended from Henry VIII. I'm paraphrasing there slightly. So it's really an astonishing speech. It's certainly the first time there had ever been a speech like that by a woman to a massive army. Other reports of the event, I mean, when she got to the part about, but I had the blood of a king, an English king, I mean, all 23,000 of them just erupted. I mean, she was the most popular woman in the world at that moment. I mean, those 23,000 troops would have done anything for her. So it was really an amazing moment as she met with her troops. So, before I turn it over